Hello, and welcome to this video, which focuses on the L in LGBT, and more specifically on some of the unique stresses faced by lesbians, both from general society and also from within the lesbian community itself. My name is Leila Breckman, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm filming this as part of the Advanced Specialist Diploma in Gender, Sex and Relationship Diversity Therapy, run by Pink Therapy. To introduce myself, I am a white, British, cis, queer woman. I am able-bodied, atheist, and I am a lesbian. Before I move on, I just want to acknowledge one of the limitations of this video, and that is that it is focused on Western culture, specifically the UK. This is due to time restrictions for this video, as well as a lack of available research more broadly, which is desperately needed. I'll start by running through what I'm going to focus on today. This video is very much an overview of the subject, but there will be some slides at the end with references if folks want to continue their learning. So I'll start with a definition of who we're talking about and why we're talking about them, and then briefly explain the minority stress model, the impact of misogyny and the patriarchy on lesbians specifically, and how these two intersect in a really unique way in the form of lesbophobia. And then finally, I'll talk about intra-community stress, which is the stresses which come from within the lesbian community itself. So who or what are we talking about when we use the label lesbian? Again, from a UK perspective, the Oxford English Dictionary describes a lesbian as a woman who is sexually attracted to another woman, which is simplistic to the point of being exclusionary. Not everyone in same-sex relationships identifies as a lesbian, of course, and not all lesbians are women. Under the umbrella of the term lesbian, we have cis women, trans women, non-binary, gender fluid, genderqueer, or trans-masculine people who may not want or do not fit into the definition of woman. The term also encompasses all gender expressions, from femme-presenting to butch to androgynous to everything in between and outside of binary gender expressions. There are ideological tensions about who gets to be defined as a lesbian, as I'll speak about later, but to be clear, when I am talking about lesbians in this video, all of the above are included. The truth is that there is a rich history of what it means to be a lesbian and of lesbianism that has always included gender non-conforming people. There are many different experiences and identities within lesbianism. It's important to recognise this to avoid treating lesbians as a homogeneous group, because in reality, different identities and expressions have different privileges and challenges when living in a heteronormative, cisnormative and patriarchal society. So when working with lesbian clients, as when working with all clients, it's really important to be working through an intersectional lens. I want to talk now about the minority stress model. Often credited to Ilian Meyer, the term was actually first coined by an American social worker called Virginia Brooks, who in 1981 wrote her book Minority Stress and Lesbian Women. The idea was further developed by Meyer in 2003, and it basically explains the higher rates of psychological distress amongst those from sexual minority populations as a consequence of the unique stresses caused by being part of a stigmatized minority group, and from chronic exposure to stigma, discrimination, and social exclusion from society. There are two main types of unique stressors: distal or external stressors and proximal or internal ones. Distal stressors are overt homophobic events such as discrimination, prejudice, rejection, or violence based on someone's sexual minority identity. Examples are verbal or physical abuse, exclusion from social or professional settings, or legal inequalities due to minority status. Proximal stressors are stressors which occur within us and are influenced by our perceptions and reactions to distal stressors. Proximal stressors include internalized stigma, shame and oppression, anticipatory stress or hypervigilance, or an expectation or anxiety about potential discrimination or rejection occurring, and identity concealment. These stressors are tied to how someone internalizes societal prejudice and how much they expect to face discrimination in everyday life. The impacts of minority stress are multiple and include poorer mental and physical health, social isolation, internalized oppression, as well as identity confusion and delay in identity exploration and formation. So that's a very brief overview of the minority stress model, which looks at sexual minority populations as a whole. When it comes to the lesbian community, however, there are additional specific factors which intersect with the stresses of their sexual minority identity, namely the impact of misogyny and of living within a patriarchal society. The patriarchy is a system of oppression which prioritises men and male dominance both in public and private spheres. A key element of it is its rigid expectation of gender roles, not least in relationships. By prioritising men and male privilege, women and their roles in society are devalued. Patriarchy props up misogyny, homophobia, queerphobia, and creates heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and hetero and cis sexism. Misogyny is defined as prejudice and hatred towards women and is a result of patriarchal systems of oppression, the consequences of which include gender-based violence, economic equality, pressure to conform to gender roles and expectations, barriers to education, health inequality, social inequality, and more. The impact of misogyny is pervasive and affects nearly every aspect of life and creates a minority stress of its own. Lesbians, whether they are cis, trans and/or non-binary, face the dual oppression of sexism because of their gender and homophobia because of their sexual orientation, which is known as lesbophobia, which I will talk about next. It's important to note that trans and non-binary lesbians face yet another layer of oppression due to transphobia and the challenges of existing in a cis-normative society. Lesbophobia refers to the prejudice, discrimination and hatred directed specifically at lesbians. It is a form of discrimination and prejudice that targets lesbians where homophobia intersects with misogyny in a specific way, creating a unique set of challenges for lesbians. Lesbophobia can manifest in many forms, overtly, such as physical or sexual violence, or in more insidious ways, such as the erasure of lesbian identities from mainstream society. Lesbophobia arises in a world dominated by heteronormative values, where heterosexual relationships are seen as the only acceptable or legitimate form of intimacy. This leads to exclusion of lesbians from mainstream social, political, and cultural narratives, pressure to conform to heterosexual norms, and lesbian relationships being dismissed or misunderstood as abnormal, deviant, or inferior. Lesbophobia can also be linked to homonormativity, which refers to the assimilation of LGBTQ+ identities into mainstream heteronormative society. Under homonormativity, lesbians may feel pressure to present their relationships or sexualities in ways that fit into societal norms, such as portraying a relationship that society deems respectable or mainstream, rather than embracing a more diverse or radical expression of lesbian identity. This can further reinforce narrow ideas about what it means to be a lesbian and also create tension within both the lesbian and wider LGBTQ communities. I want to talk now about some of the key elements of lesbophobia, starting with the erasure of lesbian identities. Patriarchal society is often dismissive of lesbian relationships, which of course do not include men, and so it seeks to delegitimize their status and existence. Lesbophobia also intersects with harmful gender norms, which dictate that women's identities and worth are tied to their relationships with men. This can create pressure for lesbians to conform to heteronormative expectations or to hide their sexual identity. This invisibility and erasure of lesbian experiences occurs in both heterosexual and LGBT narratives. For instance, many stories in the media focus on gay male experiences, leaving lesbians out of representation. The consequence of this erasure is what Miranda Fricker described as hermeneutical injustice, a specific kind of injustice that occurs when someone is unable to make sense of their own experiences due to gaps or biases in the collective social knowledge or resources available to them. Objectification and stereotyping. Lesbians often face harmful stereotypes that reduce their identity to a sexual or fetishized object seen through the male gaze. With this comes the idea that lesbians are simply waiting for the right man, or that they exist only as part of male fantasies. Stereotypes also exist around so-called acceptable gender expressions for lesbians. This is the assumption that you must either be butch or femme, which ignores the vast diversity that exists within lesbian identities. These stereotypes can lead to lesbians invalidating or questioning their sexuality. Violence and hate crimes. Like other LGBTQ+ individuals, lesbians are at risk of violence, physical assault, and hate crimes. However, lesbophobia can add an additional layer of risk, making lesbians vulnerable to specific forms of aggression and sexual violence, particularly those who do not conform to traditional gender roles or expressions. An example of this is so-called corrective rape, which is the use of rape and sexual assault to both punish and to cure so-called abnormal behaviour, and to reinforce societal norms. And then finally, exclusion in LGBTQ plus spaces. So whilst LGBTQ plus spaces are meant to be safe and inclusive, lesbians can sometimes be marginalised or even excluded within their own communities. This exclusion can take the form of prioritising gay men's issues or a failure to address specific challenges faced by lesbians. Many LGBTQ spaces are gay male focused, and of course, within the few spaces that there are, gender diverse lesbians may also face marginalisation or be made to feel unwelcome. I want to talk now about intra-community stress, which is the unique pressures, challenges and conflicts that arise from within the lesbian community itself. This is distinct from the external stress caused by broader societal discrimination, which we have already discussed. This is more about how internalised attitudes, divisions and expectations can affect individuals from within the community. Can create legitimacy stress, feelings of illegitimacy when it comes to claiming a lesbian orientation and identity. One of the key elements of intracommunity stress comes from differing ideological ideas and conflicts about what it means to be a lesbian. There are two differing ideological starting points, so-called political lesbianism versus the idea of being a lesbian as a sexual orientation being about attraction. In her essay, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, which was published in 1980, Adrienne Rich rejected the notion that sexual orientation is an innate trait. She suggested that under patriarchy, women's sexuality is constructed to serve men. To combat men's oppression of women through compulsory heterosexuality, Rich offered lesbianism. So from the political lesbianism perspective, it becomes more about offering women a way to escape the shackles of patriarchy rather than being about sexual attraction itself. This is in conflict with the born this way narrative of sexuality and sexual orientation that is mostly understood today, along with an increased focus on inclusivity, diversity, and of queerness. Added to this is the existence of trans-exclusionary radical feminists within the lesbian community, often aligned to Rich's political lesbianism concept and rooted in transphobia, which focuses on using the gender essentialist argument of biological sex to decide as to who gets to be and be defined as a lesbian. This ideology has created tension, conflict, and significant divisions within the lesbian community, as it posits the idea that some lesbians are more legitimate than others. This divide has really damaged the idea of being a lesbian. For a while, it seemed as though the term was almost synonymous with trans-exclusionary ideas. However, over the past few years, there does seem to have been a pushback against this, in particular from Gen Z lesbians on social media, who have been reclaiming the word and vocally proclaiming its inclusion of non-binary people, trans men and women, and widening the definition of lesbian experiences in general. Another example of intra-community stress is the notion of gold star lesbians, which originated from within the community to elevate women who had never had relationships with men. It's controversial and problematic for several reasons, as it enforces certain ideas about purity, authenticity, and the correct way to be a lesbian, and is rooted in biphobia. Luckily, this particular expectation is less prevalent than it was, as a shift of attitudes grow towards inclusivity and diversity. Many lesbians today view this as an outdated, harmful, and unnecessary concept, but nonetheless, it still serves to show the specific stresses the community can place upon each other. Intra-community stress can be exacerbated by an intersection of marginalised identities. People belonging to multiple groups may experience unique stresses due to feeling marginalised or excluded from the lesbian community. I mentioned homonormativity earlier, but I just want to return to it briefly, as it can be reiterated by those within the community, as can all forms of lesbophobia. The pressure to conform or assimilate to a certain type of relationship or a certain type of gender expression can create stress and pressure in order to be accepted by peers. A part of this is also lesbian identity policing, which is judgment that comes from within the lesbian community when someone's identity doesn't match the accepted image of what a lesbian should look like. For example, for looking too feminine. This can lead to feelings of shame and rejection and legitimacy stress. So thank you for listening to my overview of the stresses faced by lesbians, both from wider society and from within the lesbian community itself. I hope that you found it interesting and that there are things you can take from it to consider when working with lesbian clients. The next two slides are just some references to aid further learning. Thank you very much.